I was 59 when everything shifted. Until then, I had lived my life quietly. Dutifully, some might say. I was the kind of woman who checked all the right boxes. Wife, mother, grandmother. A woman of routine, of responsibility. But as I stood in the doorway of my attic one late afternoon, I realized how much of my own story I had shelved away. How many chapters I had left unread, even in my own book. It had been over a decade since William died. My husband of 35 years had departed quietly in his sleep, leaving behind a house full of memories and a silence I never quite got used to. After the funeral, I did what I thought strong women did. I cleaned the downstairs, packed away his clothes, and kept moving. But the attic? I couldn't touch it. That was where the echoes lived. The laughter, the arguments, the photos, and the part of myself I had quietly buried. But that day, something flickered in me, a need to face it. Maybe it was the weather, a rare spring breeze that carried the scent of lilacs and something older, more tender. Or maybe I was simply tired of being afraid of my own past. So I climbed the stairs, knees creaking like the old wood beneath my feet. A thick layer of dust greeted me with the scent of time, cardboard, old fabric, and something that felt like longing. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing it in. Then I opened the first box. Inside was a photo album I hadn't touched in years. The cover had faded and the edges curled like aging petals. I opened it carefully, as if it might shatter in my hands. And there she was. Me, but not the me I had become. I was in my 20s, on a beach somewhere with a drink in one hand and a laugh frozen in time. A yellow bikini, oversized sunglasses, and a confidence that radiated off the page. My skin tanned from the sun, my hair wild from the wind. I didn't remember what I was laughing at, but the joy in my expression made my chest tighten. I had forgotten that version of myself, forgotten that she had ever existed. I don't know how long I stared at that photo before I heard footsteps behind me. "Grace?" a voice called. I turned, startled. There in the doorway stood Ethan, my step-grandson. It had been 3 years since I'd last seen him. He had left town for work, and in truth, I wasn't sure when or if I'd see him again. He looked different. Broader shoulders, a quiet confidence in his stance. At 29, he had grown out of the awkwardness I remembered. He held a coffee cup in one hand and a brown paper bag in the other. "I saw your car out front," he said with a smile. "Thought I'd stop by." "Ethan," I said, warmth flooding through me. "You gave me a start." He stepped inside, brushing a cobweb from his arm. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the album in my lap. "What's that?" "Just old memories," I replied, holding it a little closer. But he was already beside me, peering down. He pointed at the photo. "Is that you?" I hesitated, then nodded, a small laugh escaping despite myself. "Once upon a time." He studied the image longer than I expected. "Wow," he said finally, glancing up at me. "I wouldn't have guessed. You look, well, incredible." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, unexpected and warm. It had been years since someone looked at me like that. Not as someone to be pitied, not as someone to be grieved with, but as a woman. A person. We sat down among the boxes, and he began flipping through the album. Each page was like a time capsule. Fashion disasters, spontaneous road trips, parties that stretched into the early hours. Photos I had forgotten even existed, and each one peeled back another layer of who I once was. "You used to be wild," Ethan said with a grin, holding up a photo of me in a red sequin dress at a club in New York. "I had my moments," I replied, laughing. "We all do." The lightness in the attic shifted. The dust didn't seem as heavy. The air, once dry and choking, felt almost breathable. In the presence of someone who hadn't seen those parts of me before, I began to see them differently myself. Ethan turned the last page and looked at me. "You're really something, Grace." I didn't know how to respond. The honesty in his voice was disarming. It wasn't flirtation. It was something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Or admiration. Whatever it was, it stirred something I hadn't felt in years. We spent the rest of the afternoon opening boxes, finding old letters, costume jewelry, faded notebooks. He listened to my stories, asked questions, and laughed with genuine delight at each forgotten anecdote. I watched him, noticing how he had matured, not just in appearance, but in manner. Thoughtful, engaged, present. At some point, I found an emerald green dress I had worn to a friend's wedding when I was 25. The fabric shimmered even under the attic's dim light. "Try it on," Ethan suggested, eyes lighting up. "Oh, please," I chuckled. "It wouldn't fit me now." There's only one way to find out. His enthusiasm was contagious. I slipped into the hallway, closed the door behind me, and took a deep breath. The zipper slid up more easily than I expected. When I stepped back into the attic, Ethan's expression changed. "You look amazing," he said quietly. Something in the way he said it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. Not as someone's widow, not as a grandmother, just me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat on the attic floor, surrounded by fragments of my past. He reached over and took my hand, not as a gesture of romance, but of connection, of comfort. "Grace," he said, voice low, "it's like I'm meeting you for the first time." I looked at him, my heart full of questions I couldn't yet ask. But one thing was clear, something had shifted. Not just between us, but within me. I was waking up. The attic became our sanctuary. After that first afternoon, Ethan kept coming back. At first, it was under the innocent guise of helping me clean out the boxes, but neither of us pretended for long. The attic wasn't just a storage space for old belongings. It had become a place where time folded in on itself, where memories rose to the surface like forgotten melodies, and where two people, separated by years and circumstance, found themselves slowly being drawn together. Each day he arrived with coffee in hand and a casual smile, like we had always done this. Like this fragile connection between us wasn't delicate or strange. He never made me feel judged, only seen. We worked our way through the attic slowly, laughing over forgotten souvenirs, reading aloud from aged birthday cards, and piecing together fragments of who I used to be. I found a box of records and an old turntable, and we spent one afternoon dancing awkwardly to dusty vinyl in the middle of the clutter. I hadn't danced in years, but the moment that changed everything happened on a quiet Tuesday. The kind of day that starts without any warning that something inside you is about to shift. I had been going through a box marked Clothes 1980s when I found it, the emerald green dress. I recognized it immediately. I had worn it to my cousin Lydia's wedding in Charleston. I remembered the way William had looked at me that night, the way I had felt, alive, radiant, and utterly myself. The fabric was soft, the colors still vibrant. The neckline plunged just enough to be bold, and the waist cinched in a way that made me feel like I had a shape worth admiring. I held it up in front of me, smiling at the memory. "You should try it on," Ethan said from behind me, startling me slightly. I turned to find him leaning against a stack of boxes, arms crossed, eyes glinting with playful challenge. "Oh, I'm sure it doesn't fit," I replied, laughing it off. "There's only one way to find out," he said, echoing the same words he'd used a few days earlier. I hesitated. It felt silly. And yet, something about the way he looked at me, without expectation, without pressure, made me want to try. Maybe just to see if I could still be that woman in the photograph. I stepped into the hallway and pulled the dress over my head. The fabric slid down like a secret. I reached behind to zip it up, breath held, expecting resistance. But it fit. Perfectly. As if it had been waiting for this moment. I stared at my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the same girl from the wedding, no. But she was something else. Someone who had lived through grief and solitude, and who was still standing. Still capable of beauty. Still capable of desire. When I returned to the attic, Ethan sucked in a breath. He said nothing for a moment, just stared. And then softly, "You look stunning." Heat rose to my cheeks. I wasn't used to being looked at like that anymore. like I was more than the sum of my years and losses, like I was still a woman. "Thank you," I said quietly, unsure of what else to say. The air between us felt charged, like something had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. We didn't speak of it directly. Instead, we went back to sorting boxes, though the mood had changed. We sat a little closer. We laughed a little softer. And every now and then, our eyes would meet and linger for a second too long. That night after he had gone, I found myself in the living room staring at the photo album again. The images of my younger self felt less distant now. The woman in those photos wasn't gone. She had just been waiting. But my thoughts wouldn't settle. I kept returning to the look in Ethan's eyes, the way he had said I looked stunning. It was more than just a compliment. It was recognition, and it stirred something in me that I didn't know what to do with. The next day, as I washed dishes in the kitchen, I felt a presence behind me. Ethan's hand rested gently on my shoulder. "You're overthinking again," he said. I turned to look at him. "How could I not?" I whispered. Whatever this is, it's not normal." He didn't flinch. "Who decides what's normal?" His words hung in the air like a challenge. I couldn't answer. All I knew was that I felt both seen and unsettled, alive and ashamed. It was a confusing place to be. We didn't talk about it again directly, but the silence between us was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, with the echo of glances and shared memories. And slowly, I began to admit something to myself. I didn't feel invisible anymore. One afternoon, we found an old shoebox filled with letters. Most were from friends, but one envelope stood out. It was addressed simply, "To Grace, when you need it most." I froze. It was William's handwriting. The paper trembled in my hands as I opened it. Ethan sat beside me, respectfully quiet. I unfolded the letter and began to read. "My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there beside you. I pray that when this moment comes, you're not alone. Loving you was the greatest joy of my life. But life goes on, even after one of us leaves. And it should be lived, boldly and without apology. If someone comes along who sees you, who brings laughter back into your life, who reminds you of your own light, don't turn away. Love them, live, for both of us." Tears streamed down my face before I even finished. Ethan placed a hand gently on my back, grounding me. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I think so," I whispered. "I don't know." The truth was, I didn't know what I felt. Relief, perhaps. Permission. Or maybe just the overwhelming weight of possibility. The days that followed were filled with small moments that felt bigger than they should have. The way Ethan's hand brushed mine as we reached for the same book. The way he laughed when I told him a story from my college days. The comfort I found in his presence. But with that comfort came guilt. Not because of William, not anymore. His letter had given me a kind of peace I never expected to find. But because of what others would say. Because of how people would look at me. Because it wasn't just love. It was unconventional. And people are not always kind to what they don't understand. Still, I couldn't pretend I didn't feel something. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, our hands reached for the same cutting board. Our fingers touched and didn't move. Slowly, I looked up. "This is complicated," I said quietly. "It doesn't have to be," he replied. "It is," I said, swallowing hard. "I'm your step-grandmother." He didn't blink. "But you're not my blood. You came into my life through William, yes, but not as a parent, not in that way." I broke eye contact, wrapping my arms around myself. "People will talk. They already do." "Let them," he said, stepping closer. "They don't know you. They don't know us. They don't know how this came to be." His certainty scared me, not because it was wrong, but because part of me wanted to believe it too. I spent that night in restless silence, the photo album open beside me, I flipped through pages, each image a reminder of who I had been, who I still was beneath the layers of grief and time. Who gets to decide what love looks like? I didn't have an answer, but I knew this. For the first time in years, I felt like I was waking up. Like the parts of me I thought were gone forever had merely been waiting, quietly, for someone to notice. And Ethan did. He saw me. Not just the woman who had lost her husband, or the grandmother who baked cookies at Christmas. He saw the woman in the red dress, in the yellow bikini, in the emerald gown. The woman who had once danced barefoot on rooftops and laughed until her stomach hurt. He saw Grace. And slowly, I began to see her too. For a while, it felt like we existed in a pocket of time, Ethan and I. We had created something gentle and unspoken, a rhythm of shared glances and quiet understanding. The days passed with an ease I hadn't felt in years. We cooked together. We even danced in the kitchen. We laughed like we had known each other forever, though we had never truly known each other like this before. But time doesn't stop for anyone, and secrets, even the tender ones, have a way of slipping into the open. It began with whispers. One evening, I was walking back from the market, a canvas bag of apples and fresh bread in hand. As I passed the neighborhood cafe, I heard two women murmuring near the patio fence. I didn't catch every word, but I caught enough. Can you imagine? Grace, of all people, with her step-grandson? That's just disgusting. She's lost her mind. Poor William must be spinning in his grave. I didn't break stride. I walked right past them, my jaw tight, my spine straight. But inside, I was unraveling. When I got home, Ethan was already there, sitting on the porch with a book in his lap. He looked up and smiled, but I couldn't return it. They're talking about us, I said, my voice barely above a breath. He stood immediately, concern etched into his features. Grace. I shook my head. They're calling me shameful. They think I've betrayed William. Ethan reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I don't know if I can do this, I said. I thought I could be brave, but maybe I'm not. Let them talk, he said. They don't understand. They don't see you the way I do. But his words didn't reach me, not fully. I was too far inside my own head. What would William say? That question haunted me like a ghost. I tried to remember his voice, his laugh, the way he used to say my name when he was tired. I missed him in a new way, because I wasn't missing the man I lost. I was missing the permission to live without him. And then, everything came crashing down. It was a Saturday afternoon when my daughter, Claire, showed up at my doorstep. She didn't knock. She burst in like a storm, her eyes wide with disbelief, her voice already rising. Is it true? She demanded. What I'm hearing from neighbors, what people are saying, are you involved with Ethan? I stood frozen in the kitchen, clutching the edge of the counter for balance. Claire, please, I started, but she cut me off. How could you, Mama? He's practically family. No, he's not, I said, trying to stay calm. He's not blood, Claire, and I've never been a grandmother to him. We barely knew each other until recently. That doesn't make it right, she snapped. You helped raise him. He feels like one of us. What would Dad think if he were here? And that's when I remembered. The letter. I hadn't read it since that day in the attic. I had tucked it away in my drawer, afraid of what it might awaken again. But now it felt necessary, like it had been written for this exact moment. Without a word, I walked down the hall, opened the drawer, and pulled out the envelope. I handed it to Claire with trembling fingers. Read it, I said. All of it. She hesitated, then took the letter and sank into the nearest chair. The silence stretched between us as her eyes moved across the page. I watched her face as she read, watched the disbelief soften, the tension in her shoulders loosen. When she finished, she folded the letter slowly and set it on the table. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, I replied. Just try to understand. She looked down at her hands. He's so much younger than you, Mom. What could he possibly want? I didn't answer right away. I stared out the window, watching the wind stir the garden I had planted years ago. He sees me, I said finally. Not as a widow. Not as an old woman. He sees me as someone who still has something to give. He reminds me that I'm not finished yet. Claire was quiet for a long moment, then softly, I just don't want you to get hurt. I nodded. Neither do I. That night, after Claire left, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, the stars above me and Ethan beside me. I told him about the confrontation, about the letter, about everything. She's trying, I said. I think she's scared for me, but she's trying. He took my hand. That means something. I nodded. It does. And then, just when I thought I had no tears left, something inside me cracked open. I've carried so much guilt, I admitted. Not just about William, about myself, about the years I let slip by, about how I let myself disappear. Ethan turned to face me, his expression gentle. You haven't disappeared, Grace. You've just been waiting. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw the truth in his eyes. But the emotional twist didn't come from outside. It came from within. That night, I had a dream. I was in my old house, the one William and I lived in when we first got married. The walls were painted warm yellow, the floors creaked, and the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee. I walked through the rooms, searching for something, someone. And then I saw William. He was sitting in his favorite chair, reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled, the way he always did. I didn't think I'd see you again, I said in the dream. You didn't, he replied. But I've always been here, Gracie. I knelt beside him, tears in my eyes. I'm so sorry. For what? He asked, folding the paper. For letting go. He chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. You're not letting go. You're living. There's a difference. I woke up with tears on my pillow and a strange sense of peace in my chest. It was as if he had given me his blessing all over again. And somehow, that made all the difference. The days that followed weren't easy. The whispers didn't stop overnight. Some friends stopped calling. A few neighbors crossed the street when they saw me coming. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't ashamed anymore, not of my past, not of my grief, and not of my heart. Ethan and I started talking more openly. We made plans, small ones at first, a day trip to the coast, a hike in the hills, a cooking class on Saturday mornings. With every shared moment, I felt more alive, and slowly, the world began to soften. Claire came by again. This time she brought her daughter, my granddaughter Megan. She didn't say much that day, but she stayed for dinner. And when she hugged me goodbye, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The murmurs eventually faded, not all at once, not with any grand announcement or act of forgiveness. But over time, as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the whispers softened into silence. The neighbors found new topics to discuss. The stares became less sharp, and the judgment, so loud in those early days, drifted into the background like the hum of a distant radio. It wasn't that people approved, it's that they moved on. But I hadn't. Not entirely. I was still learning to live without apology. Ethan and I never tried to define what we were. We didn't rush to call it anything. We simply continued. We woke up and drank coffee together. We made dinner without ceremony. We spent time in the garden, pruning roses and pulling weeds. And sometimes when the day was just right, we'd take the car out and get lost on back roads, letting the wind carry us to places we hadn't meant to find. There was no grand romance, no dramatic declarations, just a quiet companionship that deepened with every shared glance, every unspoken understanding. And that was more than enough. One morning, I woke to find a small envelope tucked beneath my teacup on the kitchen table. It wasn't fancy, just a folded piece of paper, my name written in Ethan's handwriting. Inside was a single line. You gave me back my life. Let me help you live yours too. I sat there for a long time, the paper trembling between my fingers. I hadn't expected anything from him. That was the truth. I had expected companionship, maybe affection, but that was something else altogether. That was love. And still, even then, I hesitated. Because love in your 60s doesn't come with the same reckless abandon it does in your 20s. It comes with caution, with the weight of memory, with the awareness that time is not infinite. I knew what it meant to lose someone. I knew what it meant to carry grief like a second skin. But I also knew what it meant to feel invisible. And Ethan made me feel present. He never asked me to change, never asked me to be anything other than the woman I already was. Flawed, aging, stubborn, and still learning. He never tried to erase William's memory. He simply made space beside it. That, I realized, was the most generous kind of love. One afternoon, while trimming herbs on the porch, I looked up to see Claire's car turning into the driveway again. This time, she wasn't alone. Megan sat in the back seat, her face pressed curiously against the window. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped out to meet them. Claire looked tired, but not angry. There was something softer in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Hi, Mom," she said. "Hi," I replied, unsure of what to expect. She glanced toward the porch where Ethan was kneeling by a toolbox, fixing a loose step. He looked up, offered a small wave, then returned to his task. Claire watched him for a moment, then looked back at me. "I've been thinking," she said, folding her arms, "and I still don't get it. I probably never will. But I've also been doing a lot of reflecting." I waited. I've spent so much of my life trying to do what was expected, trying to be the right kind of wife, the right kind of mother, and I'm not even sure I know who I am anymore. Her voice cracked slightly and my heart ached for her. "But you?" she continued. "You're doing something I'm too afraid to do. You're choosing to live, even if it makes other people uncomfortable." I stepped closer, touched her arm. "It hasn't been easy. I know. And I'm sorry I made it harder." We stood there for a moment in silence. Then Megan called from the car, "Can I say hi to Ethan?" Claire looked at her daughter, then at me. She nodded. "It's okay." It was a small moment, but it felt like something shifted between us. A bridge being rebuilt, plank by plank. That evening, Ethan and I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in warm streaks of coral and gold. He handed me a steaming cup of chamomile tea, the same way he did every night, and settled beside me in the rocking chair. "I saw Claire talking to you," he said. "She's trying," I replied, sipping slowly. "It's not perfect, but it's something." He nodded. "That's all we can ask for." We sat in silence for a long while, rocking gently, the creak of wood beneath us, mingling with the crickets' evening song. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" I asked. "Every day," he said, "but I don't try to figure it out anymore." I looked at him, really looked at him. "You used to be just a kid to me. I remember you running through the backyard, all elbows and long legs." He chuckled. "You used to make lemonade and pretend it was the best in town?" "It was," I said with mock pride, then softer. "I never imagined this." "Neither did I. But I'm glad," I added. "I'm glad you saw something in me when I had forgotten how to see it myself." He reached for my hand and I let him hold it. There would always be people who didn't understand. There would always be raised eyebrows, whispered judgments, and the occasional side glance from someone stuck in their own idea of what was right. But none of that mattered anymore, because I wasn't living for them. I wasn't living for appearances or expectations or the version of myself I thought the world wanted. I was living for me, for the woman in the yellow bikini, for the girl who danced barefoot on rooftops, for the wife who loved deeply and lost painfully, for the mother who tried her best, and the grandmother who was still figuring it out, for the woman who had spent too long in the shadows of her own life. And now, finally, was stepping into the light. One morning, months later, as autumn began to settle in and the leaves painted the yard in bold reds and golds, Ethan surprised me with a weekend trip to the coast. We stayed at a small inn overlooking the sea. Nothing extravagant, just us, the sound of waves, and the kind of silence that felt like home. On our last night, we walked along the shore, barefoot in the cool sand. I looked at him, the lines around his eyes from laughter, the steadiness in his gaze, and I felt something settle inside me. Not a conclusion, not an ending, but a beginning. Because love, I had learned, doesn't always arrive when you expect it. It doesn't always look the way you imagined. It doesn't always come wrapped in a storybook plot or follow society's rules. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a letter waiting in a box, or a memory hidden in an attic, or a moment shared over a photo album when someone says, "You were wild once," and means it as a compliment. Love, I realized, is not a question of age or timing or titles. It's a question of recognition. And Ethan recognized me, so I chose to recognize myself.